Well, thank you, Polina, and very thorough overview of what is going on in Germany and also the projects that you mentioned. Certainly very welcome work and really well done on also bringing the psychosocial support back to the equation and also talking about volunteers. Well, my question to you, maybe a quick one, would be to do with the civil society and also the bringing it home to Gina as well, the volunteering. How, or let's say, what role do you see for civil society in the integration process on a sort of larger scale? And how can civil society navigate through the complex state structures for integration to support refugees? This is basically to begin with our panel discussion, because obviously this is something that I'm sure Gina would like to also address. And then we come back to a question that was a very interesting one about media and the role of how to hear the voice of refugees. I'll read it out later, but first of all, let's talk about these volunteers in the civil society.
Thank you. I think there are actually two directions in which the civil society could support the integration of refugees and also representations of them in front of the state structures. So on the one hand, I think the civil society should should mark the gaps that are there and help, because they work a lot with the refugees, right? They give them support when it comes to finding housing or maybe organizing help to deliver in Ukraine, whatever, and they're in direct contact with them. So I think that would be, and that could help also address the issue of proactivism, so to say, or non-reactive work of the state institutions, because the work that has been done so far, it's more reactive, and the task should be, to be proactive and maybe to be there before the need is, indeed very drastic and there. That would be one thing, and the second thing is, of course, representation, because when we talk about already established old minorities, they are there, they have certain channels of communication, certain bodies, certain structures, and they could be the one to guide the new minorities, so to say, to give a voice to them so that they're seen and they're there. And when we talk about Germany, so the old minorities, they are there and they can speak up, they have their own council in Berlin, but the new minorities, and there are a lot of them, like the Turkish minority, all the new refugee minorities from Afghanistan, from Ukraine, from Syria, they are not still represented, and that's a huge issue in Germany, for example, and in the long run, it could create also challenges.
Thank you. Thank you, Polina. And Gina, well, as we are starting now with the panel discussion here, I do, by the way, encourage you to send your questions over. I would like to, transition over to you with the, from the same place, talking about the volunteers, talking about people working with refugees. We had the discussion, and very good one, when we talked about helping these volunteers, and you touched upon it today in your presentation, talking about that they need to be structured somehow and empowered by authorities. So can you maybe elaborate on this?
Well, first of all, what we saw is that there's this huge potential, and there are already many host families who do have an experience with hosting refugees. And there are also many host families who did not experience this because it was not matched. So first of all, would be, in our opinion, the next step would be to elaborate on this, to get in touch with the families, to ask them how their experience was, to gather the data, also to get in touch with the host families who didn't receive the refugees, because they, even though they didn't have, but they showed that they have interest and they would be available. So that would be something very important that has not yet happened in Switzerland. I don't know about other countries who maybe were in a similar situation, but that would be something very important, that we also work with academia in order to touch upon these points. But besides that, what we've also seen, talking to the families and talking to the refugees, that the support system that's needed is in different ways. You know, they told me when they have a refugee at their home and they live in this normalized reality, which has a lot of benefits, like the language, the network of the family. Even I talked to a Ukrainian student who then got easier access to the university because they helped her all the way to find it in this very difficult way to get the right information, because as I mentioned, we don't have this communication platform as a one-stop shop kind of system, which is a big struggle. So there are all these benefits, but still, because they live in this normalized family life, it's also conflicting, because at times they still have family back home or people fighting in the war and so on. So they have like these two worlds often within themselves. So then we touch upon the mental health issue, where then the families often felt they couldn't deal with the situation. A lot of families it was their first experience, so they're not experienced in refugee reception at all. And they did their best by gathering this information and so on, but there's also a limit. So there's a big system that has to be built in order to support them, and also to say where it's not their duty to step in. And and we also, it was quite interesting, I asked the families, what did you do? Because like I mentioned, they were quite left by themselves. And they actually started to form own networks within other families in order to collect the information and to help them with dealing with these issues. So I find this very interesting to see how resilient, again, their civil society can be in order to improve their situation. And so we really do hope that this potential is actually seen and really taken serious. And we talked in the morning about preparing for the next crisis, and I think if you think about this really seriously and taking them into as a serious actor as well, we can support the system very well. It has been done in many other fields very well. We have a lot of experience, so yeah.
Thank you for the thorough answer. And actually, the talk from the previous panel ended with preparedness and the importance of this, and you touched upon it right now, and this was my next thing. So let's just sort of think, how can academia, how can research help us to be prepared? And let's put obviously the powerful data behind, aside for a moment. What else is there? And Sarah, I'm sure that psychosocial support and that sort of thing relies so heavily, as you showed, on academic research.
I'm really glad that you've touched on this, Anna, because I think one of the things that struck me over the last number of years is a lot of the professions that deal in a very front-facing way with people who've experienced trauma actually don't have trauma-informed education integrated into their university teaching. So I work with the National Health Service in the UK. I work with the Police Service of Northern Ireland. In addition to working with conflict-affected populations and peace-building practitioners and humanitarian practitioners, I also work with other fields that people are often surprised to hear about. But it's because we don't teach doctors what trauma responses look like often. We don't teach teachers what they look like. We don't teach social workers. We don't teach police. And yet, now many of these professions are really kind of, again, experiencing a lot of traumatized people coming through under their care. And so I think we can very simply begin to work with university programs to be able to integrate even small units of teaching around really understanding the biology of stress and trauma, understanding what to do if you're supporting someone and they start to kind of move into a stronger trauma reaction. Even as a non-clinician, what can you do in that moment to support them to stabilize them, to help them feel better. So I'm starting to work with several universities to do just that. So for their conflict transformation students, for their social work students, for their medical students, how do we have these simple integrated sort of educational pieces that allow people to kind of expand their box of tools, if you will, and to be able to move into their professional lives with certainly that academic underpinning, but also with some of those really practical tools that they will most likely need at some point in their career. I'll also say just briefly, I think that academia and practitioners can work together more effectively than often we do. I think we tend to be siloed sometimes, and I think there are some really strong examples of late of some of the research I shared and other research that's taking place where practitioners and academics are working together really closely around kind of researching what's most effective in regards to trauma-informed response, particularly with conflict-affected populations. So I'm really hopeful that we'll continue to build those collaborations and see more and more really meaningful research that come out that informs practice, but also seeing new ways for practice to inform research.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have to say that this very modern gadget is not marrying well into our medieval walls around us. So occasionally it's just blank here. So I am asking, just in case, is there anyone who wants to ask a question, please?
Hi. We've heard today a few times that it's like, if we are talking about Ukrainian refugees, it's more like solidarity. And the European community actually was really welcoming the Ukrainian refugees and so on. And then we had Jan who said that, yeah, exactly, it's so that if we are talking about Syrians or I don't know, somebody from MENA countries, then we are not so welcoming that. And I was thinking, and I would ask you to think along, is it actually unnatural that we actually see Ukrainians as Europeans, and it's like a part of our family, this us and them situation, it's like a programmed in the people actually. It's from all over the time. And do we need to be ashamed of that we are welcoming Ukrainians and maybe we are not so feeling for other nationalities, maybe who are coming from further abroad? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think that we direct it first to Jan, because I think that you have worked with not too much with sentiment, but with the real data. When it you mentioned othering, so this is there is a bridge there, I think. So perhaps you can say a few words in terms of, talking about your findings, why is this, and how much of it is about in Central Europe?
Well, I'll try to, but this is a very difficult question. And even though I do a lot of quantitative research, I do qualitative as well. And philosophically, I would be a social constructivist. So I believe that the world around us is socially constructed. And it is natural because we have already constructed the boundaries like this, our mental boundaries. This is, the mental maps that we have. At the end of the day, I believe that people are people, and we have constructed some people as more worthy than the others. And then you ask, should we be? And I've been working with these, even sentiments in media, let's say.
Sure.
So not in public opinion, but in media, and you clearly see that we have already constructed or exported such constructions from elsewhere, but we are strengthening these constructions that clearly build us and them, and at the end of the day, this is the security to solidarity. They were saying that, Central Europe is a lost cause during 2015-16. They don't want to accept refugees, that's the bad ones. They were pointing to Visegrad, and now we were saying, you see, they were not right. All these, Macrons and others, they were not right. Well, it is both yes and no, because what we are constructing is, we're constructing refugees that are the right ones, the proper ones. And that's not my words, it's what comes from my research. And the improper ones, the worthy and unworthy ones. I would, at the end of the day, be rather ashamed about it, because I believe that these are, what is natural? You said it's natural. It's difficult to say what is natural, because I believe social world is really socially constructed. So we're basically constructing what is natural. Saying then that it is natural, it's just a, circling argument, right? I've constructed something, and then I'm saying, well, you see, it's natural. Well, because you constructed it this way. So perhaps this would be my answer. But if I may, very briefly, I wanted to just reflect on what Gina mentioned, and Sara as well, basically the academia bridges. I have actually been one of the host families, and the link to academia is I exactly believe that there should be even state funding now, calls for researchers to do interviews with people who were the host families, because we've been, trying to help and solve so many problems for the family that we were hosting. We could do much easier because we speak Czech. When we go to the office, they're not going to kick us out, because sometimes in these offices, people, they have a lot of work, the wages are not great, they're tired. Somebody from Ukraine comes and they have this kind of distance, If you come with Ukrainians, they're not going to, tell you the same sometimes. Because it's 15 minutes before the closing time, they're going to just, walk you through that. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of experience, in the grassroots, in the civil society, and academia should be focusing on that, so as to inform the preparedness, the public policies, and general policy management for the next potential whatever crisis, even though I don't like the word, right? But then state should also step in terms of funding, because, right, academics can do that. We can do interviews, we can, summarize them, build some theoretical, conceptual, approaches that then can be, informing eventually public policies. But there should be an interest in the state to run up open calls within their, grant, scientific bodies, grant societies, whatever, just, focus on that. And that is something that, where easily, practitioners, and grassroots can inform research, and then research can inform, public policies, and eventually even for the grassroots responses. Because, the public policies may make it more easier next time for the civil society and the grassroots to try to help to integrate people.
Absolutely, and this is learning from the experience and designing new, better ways to be prepared, right? So thanks. And Gina wanted to say.
Yes, can I maybe add? I find it. I agree very much with what you're saying, and we can also maybe make a link to your question, because also there would be very interesting to ask actually host families. What was their motivation to host a refugee, and also would they maybe be open to host also other refugees, and because they at least had some motivation to do so. So that would be also something very interesting. And I got asked a lot about whether it's Switzerland has so many host families because the Ukrainians are much closer to us, or like you put it in a similar way. And actually, when you look into history, we can deconstruct this myth a bit of them being closer, because the reality is completely different. In Switzerland, we cannot speak, or it's a different language. We have to use a lot of the apps for translating and so on. So it's a completely different reality than thinking we're so close. And actually, when we go into history, we see, for instance, that it's often very much constructed by historical times where we are. Why are we maybe more likely to host or not to host? And also how media is constructing certain realities. For instance, when in Switzerland we had refugees from Tibet, and all of a sudden, even though they're much further away than the Ukrainians, and there suddenly were similarities drawn, apparently, by the Alpines, you know, the mountains that are so similar to Tibet and so on. So it's also very much media drawn how something more close or more far away can be. And I think we really have to look at it critically, and so that's why it would be even more also an argument to do more research.
Thank you, Gina, for this. And I think that there's another fantastic link to a very final question, panelists. We have 30 seconds, and let's try to be very, very good this time. So I'm going to finish with this question about media, which I thought was very intriguing and interesting. So there is an inquirer asking how to get migrants speak out in the media, or who should speak on their behalf. So perhaps very, very briefly, all of you. Gina?
Oh, I'm not sure I can be brief on this one. Because when we talk about media, first of all, for me, it's a bit the question who we talk about. Is it the national TV? Is it the people who speak in the TV who may be politicians or representatives? Or is it social media who do also serve certain media informations and so on? So it's very difficult to say who should be represented how in the media. And I just maybe, for a context, we had a few years ago, we had a program in the Swiss national TV where all the nationalities that live in Switzerland wanted to be shown and portrayed, and they had interviews shown and so on. And they thought that's a very nice project in order to show actually who lives in Switzerland and so on. But actually, the effect of it was that you show the one Eritrean that then a lot of people thought that's how, you know. So it's a very problematic way of doing so. And meanwhile, the whole group who did the interviews were all white Swiss, you know. So it's a question more about diversity of how media is made, under which lens, in my opinion, and not so much about how it's projected.
Sarah, do you want to take over? Your take?
My husband works for the BBC, so I don't know if he would agree with what I'm about to say or not. I think it's important, of course, to have news coverage that informs people on refugee and asylum seeker arrival and integration. But I also think refugee and asylum seekers need to be invited into other programs outside of newsmaking that are distributed by international news companies, to be pundits, to be representative voices, and representative of their human experience, if that makes sense. So if there's a conversation about education in Belfast, I would be expecting the BBC to have newcomer communities represented in that conversation, as well as longer-term residents of Belfast. So it's a very simple tool to begin to not only normalize new voices in a society, but to really bring those voices in, not just to represent their own needs, but to engage in conversation about wider society. I would also say one other thing quickly, and that is that we need to be just as good at spreading best practice and good news stories within INGOs. So for international NGOs and organizations that are offering refugee support and integration, we need to really talk about what works, because there's some really innovative things happening all the time that we don't always capture. And I think we need to be able to share with each other in our own informal networks some of the best practices that are emerging as well.
Thank you. Jan?
I would perhaps, it's impossible to be brief on that, really, but I will try to. I would link to what Sara mentioned. We do have a lot of commercial media. They have their own agendas, readership, viewership, profit. That's perfectly fine. They will always follow certain logic. But if there is a certain training, some journalists can pick up on something. But we still do have public service broadcasting and public service media, well, in many European countries, not in the US, but here we do. And they should make a better job, because you asked, who should represent refugees? Well, refugees. At best, who does it in Czechia? It's the NGOs, right? But there are still the white, regular Caucasian, local people, trying to speak on behalf of somebody else, kind of fairly, in favor of their attitudes. But still, who should represent refugees? At least sometimes it should be, them. So at least public service broadcasters should do much better job in incorporating. Very often we had these, camps in Greece, Greece, or Polish-Belarusian, border, and saying, well, oh, that's the mess, they're protesting, then destroying there. But nobody was really reporting or giving a voice to, why do you, make this mess here, or like start fires, right? Perhaps because, they would tell you about the governmental mismanagement there, how the conditions are there terrible. So we do only, try to portray this, without asking them, and in a way that it seems like, oh, people came to Greece, and they are not, now behaving well in terms, staying within the refugee camp. So I would say them, and at least in public service broadcasters more.
Thank you, Jan. Polina,
I'll be
briefly.
quick. So on the one hand, I think the state should intervene because most newcomers, most refugees are in a very vulnerable position. So I think there should be support from the top, but there should be also more awareness raising and also training for those professionals working in the field of media so that they are aware of the fact that we no longer live in one nation state, but our reality is very diverse, and it should be also reflected in the media because media is so important for the construction also of the reality we live in. So that would be my reply.
Well, thank you. Thank you, panel. Thank you, audience, with this excellent point on educating media. We conclude our panel today, and thank you so much. Thank you.